Now let's look at the significance of the summit with Gustavo de Carvalho, who's a senior researcher on Russia, Africa at the African Governance and Diplomacy Program at SAIIA. Good evening to you, Gustavo, and thank you so much for your time. President Cyril Ramaphosa and his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, holding those bilateral talks earlier. Ramaphosa telling Putin that South Africa sees Russia as a valued ally. Let's start with the significance of this meeting, given the historical ties between these two countries.
Thank you so much for having me. And I think it's an expected meeting between President Ramaphosa and President Putin. We know that South Africa, as President Ramaphosa presented in a meeting, has a historical relation with the Soviet Union. We still see the trade between the two countries being quite small. We don't often see the two countries aligning their foreign policy positions. But for both countries, it is beneficial for them in terms of their own presence and membership within BRICS that is increasingly providing different options and different ways in which they can engage with international trade, that they can provide new avenues to elevate their voices in international affairs. So I think it is an important meeting, but I wouldn't say that it's a fundamental change of historical relations that often are not so much followed by the depth in terms of day-to-day engagements.
And how then do we begin to answer the question that is raised by some, given what you say, who are saying that old alliances could potentially not survive the new realities, given the geopolitical tensions that we see sometimes simmer?
I think this is precisely why BRICS becomes such an interesting proposition for many countries. I think certainly for countries like Russia, Iran, and even to some extent China, there is a matter of survival in the global order that is not particularly favorable for them. For other countries like Brazil, like South Africa, even Ethiopia, Egypt, and UAE, this provides them more options. This provides them more ways of engaging that allows them to sustain the relationships that they already have with other parts of the world, but also to find other ways of deepening certain ties. And particularly now when we're looking into BRICS, focusing increasingly on providing means and ways to reduce fluctuations and reduce threats in terms of international trade, and particularly with local currencies. I think the geopolitical environment provides for some countries BRICS as a core option, and for other countries like South Africa provides as an important alternative and an important way that strengthens a much more diversified engagement internationally.
Now, I wonder then, speaking about, using opportunities when it comes to the summit, there are some who are saying that the Russian president will be using this particular moment to address his detractors, to say that he's not been isolated. There are others who are saying that if you do have this number of countries who have descended on Russia for this particular summit, it doesn't mean that he's then isolated. There are others, in fact, who are isolated and not him. Where are you leaning on that argument?
I think it's a complicated discussion because obviously any country that is hosting a summit of this magnitude, we saw that summit in South Africa last year, utilizes that opportunity to showcase their foreign policy, to showcase their country, and to showcase that these countries are valuable in terms of their own international presence. We do need to remember that Russia is not BRICS. Russia is part of BRICS. So to a large degree, we have a number of countries that have been invited that are there to provide that direct support to Russia and to provide that message. But I think for most of the countries that are participating, that they see in BRICS itself as an opportunity for the international engagements. And I think we need to look into carefully to not overplay the presence of a country like Russia. And I'm not saying they're not important. They are a relevant country, a relevant partner within BRICS, but the decision-making process, their ideas, and what we're going to see in the communique in the next couple of days will be a heavily negotiated discussion between all of the 9 countries, and that is a tough challenge for them to engage with, considering that all decisions within BRICS are made by consensus.
And I wonder then how much of, a negotiation and difficult conversation is it going to be to also see who else do you then admit into the bloc, given some interesting developments that we're seeing globally?
I think this is a complicated decision within BRICS, particularly because there is a clear divide within members at the moment. There was a difficult negotiation that happened last year in Kazan when the 4 new countries that decided to join were invited, and other sets of countries that either have not responded or have declined. But to a certain extent, for some countries, that means that they would like to see a bit more time for the new members to adapt and to adjust. We saw countries like Brazil, for instance, in 2023, very vocally concerned about this new expansion. And for me, it seems that the core of the debate this year will not necessarily be about a new expansion and to admit new countries, but perhaps to better clarify these partner country categories that has been a part of the BRICS vocabulary already since 2017, in terms of what is their roles, what are their responsibilities, what they can gain from being partner countries, and what they can offer to us without necessarily being elevated into members at this stage. Is it impossible for a new expansion? No, but I find it to be quite unlikely at this stage, but it'll be interesting to see what the discussions will be and what the decisions will be made on Thursday morning.
Speaking about discussions, do you think what's taking place in the Middle East can also just, feature in some of the conversations?
I think it will feature. I think geopolitical discussions tend to be part of these summits. I don't see a major role at this stage by BRICS in terms of a coordinated position to try to resolve that. We've seen in the last 15 years a number of geopolitical crises where there were attempts for some members to make BRICS more relevant within that. But achieving consensus around this is quite difficult. So to a certain degree, BRICS perhaps would continue engaging with some of the more core priorities that have been presented, issues around trade, issues around systems of payments, and some of the announcements that have already been made, and perhaps some more vague discussions and vague statements around that. I find at this stage to be quite difficult for members to really find consensus around this, but certainly will feature to a certain extent in many of the debates.
And bring it home now, how would you say this particular summit, continues to position South Africa within the international community?
I think for South Africa is an important moment because it's the first time that we see the 3 African member states within BRICS, South Africa, Egypt, and Ethiopia, together within these discussions, and how much they will be able to coordinate and to find a unified position that assists the continent in terms of its own economic growth and development path. Discussions around, for instance, in terms of the systems of payments and how that links to this new process of the African continental free trade area, and even a Pan-African payment system. I think there is a momentum to elevate African voice within BRICS, and by extent, I think it can provide a good opportunity for South Africa's leadership in ensuring that Africans' interests are well presented and represented within the decisions made by the group.
All right, Gustavo, thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure. That was Gustavo de Carvalho, the senior researcher on Russia, Africa at the African Governance and Diplomacy Program at SAIIA.